Hello. So, for this lecture, we're going to be talking about the historical context of the book of Jeremiah. Now, some of the reading that you do will have a lot more detail, but this lecture is specifically designed just to give you that broad overview, sort of the basic structure of the historical events that are taking place surrounding the book of Jeremiah. So, in getting started, I first want to show you, here's a map of the empire of Assyria at its height. So Jeremiah is set towards the end of the 7th century, so that's the 600s down into the 6th century. But prior to this, from the 8th century, when Assyria, the Assyrian Empire really began to expand under Tiglath-Pileser III. This was the expansion of the Assyrian Empire is what led to the destruction of Samaria, the exile of the northern kingdom of Israel. So by the time of the book of Jeremiah, the northern kingdom of Israel is basically no more. They're long gone by this point. Assyria, at the height of its power, and you can see in this map there in the green, in the mid 7th century, you had Assyria dominating everywhere from Egypt down into Babylon. That whole of the ancient Near East, really. They were very massive. And then you can start to see, if you look more closely, you can see they started to lose territory. And we'll fill that out a little bit. But before the time of the book of Jeremiah, Assyria was the dominant world empire, and their power started to wane. Okay, so as we go through this, we're going to be looking at both the kings of Judah and the history that's happening there, but then also looking at how they fit within the broader ancient Near Eastern context. So Assyrian Empire, they're dominating. Now we have Josiah. Josiah is the king when Jeremiah begins his public ministry, or at least when he receives his calling. He is a king from 640 to 609. Now he is presented as an idealized king. Now, when we say this, you have to remember, for the kings of Judah, these are the kings reigning in Jerusalem. David was the standard by which all kings were measured against. When you read through the book of Kings, you'll hear, these sort of evaluative statements that they were like David or they were unlike David. If they were like David, that's a statement saying they were a good king. If they were unlike David, it was, they were an idolatrous king. So David is a standard. Everyone's measured against him. But Josiah is presented as kind of this idealized version of the Deuteronomistic history. This is the history, we say a Deuteronomistic history. We're talking about when you read the book of Deuteronomy and you get to the end, and then it describes, the death of Moses, and you get to the end, and then the narrative flows right into the book of Joshua. And you read through Joshua, and the narrative flows right into the book of Judges, and so on. Ruth is a separate work, but from Judges, it goes right into Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and then again right into 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Scholars have noted that this is one continuous, or at least has some marks of being one continuous work. It's referred to as the Deuteronomistic History. It has an overall theological agenda and perspective. Josiah is presented as an idealized version, an idealized king within that Deuteronomistic history. So in 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 25, we read of Josiah, "Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, all his soul, and all his might, in conformity to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him." So you think of that phrasing, that's not accidental. No one turned to the Lord with all his heart, his soul, and his might like Josiah did. This is obviously echoing, the command to love God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, to love God with everything that you are. And Josiah is presented as the king who did that better than anyone. So he holds definitely a very special place within the history of the kings of Judah. He was the last of the righteous kings. So as we go through the different kings, and during the time of the book of Jeremiah, Josiah is going to be the last good one. Everyone after him is a bad king. And now it was during his time, you can read in 2 Kings 22 about how the book of the law was discovered while the temple was being cleaned. He oversaw large-scale reforms that are commenced in removing of idols and idolatrous priests, cleansing the temple. All these things were happening. Now, some people have wondered what exactly was the identity of the lost book when it says that he discovered the lost book. We have to wonder what exactly was it that was discovered. Now, since de Wet, he was a German scholar of the Old Testament, 1805, the book that was discovered during Josiah's reforms was assumed to be some form of the book of Deuteronomy, perhaps like chapters 5 through 26, getting a lot of that law code. Now, the reason why is because the reforms that Josiah led seem to line up very closely with the words in the book of Deuteronomy, even like down to the descriptions and the phraseology that's being used. So that was kind of the dominant theory. And this, of course, was refined by other later scholars, Wellhausen, Driver, Eisfeld, who, took de Wet's basic work and refined it. More recently, this thesis, this idea, has been challenged largely because of a reappraisal of the Book of Chronicles in relation to this history. So Chronicles was a much later work than the Deuteronomistic History. And because it came later, it was presumed to be a less accurate history. However, that's been challenged lately, and some people have looked at that and said, actually, no, this is a very reliable history, and sometimes it gives some greater detail that can be very useful. And the chronicler reports that the reforms that Josiah had begun, they actually started before the discovery of the lost book. So Josiah begins these reforms, and then the book of the law is discovered. So if the reforms began first, then they couldn't have been influenced by the book of the law because that hadn't yet been rediscovered. So it's just thrown this into question. Jack Lundbaum, he's a great scholar of the book of Jeremiah. You'll see his name come up in your research probably quite a bit. He's written very prolifically. He argued strongly that the discovered law book that was, the rediscovered law book was specifically Deuteronomy chapter 32. I'll link the article. He wrote that in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly. And then William Holliday, another great Jeremiah scholar, he argues that Deuteronomy 32 it was a strong influence on the poetry of the book of Jeremiah. So that seems to be where, I don't know if you could say there's a consensus, but that seems to be some of the best research that I've seen on exactly what it was that was discovered. So he discovers, the book of the law is discovered during his time. There's all these reforms, and not only that, there's a covenant. There was a renewing of the covenant, and you read about that in 2 Kings chapter 23. He's renewing the covenant. The covenant, this relationship that sort of defined, or this document, this understanding that was defining the relationship between God and his people Israel. And he renews that covenant. Ultimately, though, all of Josiah's forms, for as great of a king as he was, no one turned to the Lord quite with as much vigor as what he had done. Ultimately, though, all that proved to be just a delay of God's judgment. In 2 Kings 23, verses 26 and 27, so just after that statement about how Josiah is this perfect king, no one was quite like him, we read, "Nevertheless, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will also remove Judah from my sight, just as I have removed Israel. And I will reject this city which I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the temple of which I said, my name shall be there." So, for as great as Jeremiah was, it still did not turn away God's wrath against Judah because of the things which, a predecessor, Manasseh, this king who had lived for a very long time, and had introduced significant idolatry into the land, not only just idolatry, but actually bringing it into the temple. So that was a very serious sin, transgression, not just idolatry, but actually to move the idols into the temple of Yahweh. It was very significant. So ultimately, God's wrath was not going to be put off. The people were going to go into exile. So that is a little bit of Jeremiah. Now, we need to kind of take a step back and kind of have an interlude. So this is back to the map that we saw earlier. So the kingdom of Assyria, again, dominating the ancient Near East during the 7th century. There was a succession of very powerful Assyrian kings. Ashurbanipal was the last of the great kings of Assyria. So Ashurbanipal, the last great king, he dies in the year 627. And this kind of marks a significant turning point in the strength and the power of Assyria throughout the ancient Near East. This is a picture it's depicting Ashurbanipal during what's called the Lion Hunt. So these are a series of relief panels that are on display at the British Museum if you ever go in there, which if you're ever in London, you really do need to visit the British Museum. A lot of incredible artifacts from the world of the Bible that illustrate and illuminate a lot of the history of the biblical world. But you go into this room and it's filled with all these relief images of these fierce, ferocious lions and Ashurbanipal hunting, killing these lions. And this is an illustration, a depiction of the king's power, his lordship over even nature. So you have depictions of kings conquering cities. Well, you also have kings conquering, fierce wild animals. Again, just an illustration of their power. Ashurbanipal, again, significant ruler. Not only that, he was actually an accomplished scholar. Much of our texts from the ancient world that have been discovered, inscriptions that have been discovered, are from the so-called Library of Ashurbanipal, which was this was a library to rival Alexandria. And many of those texts have been preserved. Reportedly, Ashurbanipal himself was able to read the cuneiform writing, which was a very significant thing. Very few kings were able to do that themselves. Ultimately, though, he dies in the year 627. You remember Josiah, he became king in 640. So he became king. Ashurbanipal is ruling. And then while Josiah is king, Ashurbanipal dies. Okay, this is signaling the collapse of the Assyrian Empire. Now, moving further south, so you have the area called Mesopotamia. Assyria is centered in the north, and then you had Babylon in the south. Now, moving south, we have this new Babylonian king, Nabopolassar. He becomes king in the year 627, so just after the death of Ashurbanipal. New king, he begins a new dynasty in Babylon, the so-called Chaldean dynasty. And in this year, Babylon declares their independence from Assyria. So for a long time, going back into the 8th century, Assyria has dominated the ancient Near East and has controlled not only the region of Judah, which we're interested in, but even as far as Babylon. And now, 626, Babylon declares independence. By the year 612, Babylon, along with the Medes, even attacked Nineveh, which was the capital at this time of the Assyrian Empire. Okay, so I think I have a map here. Okay, so Babylon, at the beginning of the red line there in southern Mesopotamia, Babylon moves north. They go in to attack Nineveh, and the last king there, Ashur-uballit II, then flees, and you can see moving across westward from Nineveh to the city of Haran. So Babylon is now not just declared independence, now they are expanding and taking over the Assyrian Empire. Now, Egypt at this time moves to take control of the Levant, the area of Judah, and right there along the Mediterranean Sea. Egypt moves in, takes control of the Levant, and they go to join Assyria in fighting against the Babylonians. Okay, so now Egypt is allied itself with Assyria, and they're both now fighting against Babylon, who is rapidly expanding here. Josiah, for his part, he goes to cut off the Egyptians. He wants to stop them from joining the Assyrians and fighting against the Babylonians. So, wait a minute. Let me say that again. Josiah wants to cut off the Egyptians to stop them from joining Assyria and fighting against the Babylonians. Sorry, just to make sure I'm saying this correctly. So Josiah attempts to do this, and unfortunately, he meets Pharaoh Necho, who is coming. There's that red line going up across the southern side of the Mediterranean Sea, moving northward, that red line. Josiah, coming up from Jerusalem, following that blue line, goes to try to cut off Pharaoh and stop him at Megiddo. And unfortunately, that is where Josiah dies. You can read about that in 2 Kings at the end of chapter 23 and verse 29. So Josiah is killed there. It's a very abrupt ending to the life of Josiah. It just ends very suddenly. Now, then we get to the next king. Now, at this point, Babylon is rapidly expanding. Egypt has control of the Levant. And we have Josiah's son, Jehoahaz. He becomes king in 609 when Josiah dies, but he is only king for 3 months. Pharaoh has firm control of this area, and Pharaoh has him imprisoned at Riblah. Later, he is moved and eventually taken to Egypt to die there. But he's only king for 3 months, so he's a very minor figure in all of this. Pharaoh installs instead Jehoahaz's brother, Jehoiakim, as the new king, and he is king from 609 to 598. Okay, presumably this is someone who Pharaoh felt he could more easily control. They needed to have someone to be king there, and of course Egypt is going to want someone to be king whom they felt that they had, they could control a little bit more easily. So Jehoiakim is installed. He's king for 11 years there. Now, Egypt had control of Judah at first, the Levant, but eventually Babylon is going to decisively defeat Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in the year 605. And when this happens, when Babylon defeats Egypt, Egypt is going to retreat from the Levant. And so now Judah is under the control of a new king, and that would be Nebuchadnezzar II. Okay? So we see how things are changing. It's a time of, drastic political upheaval that we see during the book of Jeremiah. So 598, Jehoiakim seems to get sick. His death is not entirely explained, but 598, he dies, and then it seems as though he had been, he had been rebelling against Babylonian rule, and then he dies. But in 598, there is a very significant, large-scale exile to Babylon, and Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, is, his son, his successor. He's king for only 3 months, and he surrenders to Babylon, and he is taken in exile. So again, just like Jehoahaz was only king for 3 months, Jehoiakim, he's only king for 3 months. So relatively insignificant. He reigns for these 3 months. He's exiled to Babylon, along with thousands of others. Again, this was a significant exile, including the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel, if you read in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, he talks about how he was among the exiles, and he dates his vision that he has in chapter 1 to the 5th of the month in the fifth year. Let's see, the 5th of the 4th month in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile. So he's part of that group. Now, there have been some records that have been discovered in Babylon near where the Ishtar Gate was located. The Ishtar Gate, if you look up, gates of Babylon, this would be the one that you probably would see. It's this blue lapis lazuli stone. It has been, it was removed from Babylon, and it is now on display at the Pergamum Museum in Berlin. I hope to be able to go visit someday and be able to see it for myself. They found some records that was about how Jehoiakim was being treated during exile. And apparently, he was able to have and to raise children in exile. The rations that were provided for him and his family seemed to be quite large, at least comparatively speaking. You get the picture that Jehoiakim is being treated as like a royal guest in the house. He was in exile, but he wasn't an exile living in prison. He was in exile as a guest at the royal house. That seems to be more the picture that we have of Jehoiakim and his ending. Then we have the last of the kings, Zedekiah. So he becomes king after Jehoiakim is taken into exile, 598 to 587. Again, another 11-year reigns, Josiah's son. He is an evil king. Apparently, he was following in the footsteps of Jehoiakim, the one who had reigned for 11 years also. He rebelled against Babylon, and that led ultimately to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, very significantly, and the final exile of people to Babylon. Only the very poorest people were allowed to remain there in Judah, what was left of Judah, to work the land there. So Zedekiah is the last of the kings. Okay, now I have another map here. So this is now a map of the Babylonian Empire. Okay, and you can follow the line there about how the Judeans were taken into exile. They wouldn't cut straight across the Arabian desert. Anyone who wanted to cross, to get over to Mesopotamia, you would go straight up north and then follow along the Euphrates River if you wanted to make the journey over to Babylon. So that's how the exiles were led. And then, there were still some people left in the land, including Jeremiah, after this final exile and the destruction of Jerusalem under Zedekiah. And so Nebuchadnezzar of the Babylonians installed a man by the name of Gedaliah as governor in 587. So after Jerusalem had been destroyed, until 582. He encouraged the people to replant the fields, the vineyards, the things that had been destroyed. He encouraged the people to do that. Ultimately, though, he is going to be murdered by the Judeans under the former soldiers under Zedekiah. Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 14, tells us that Ishmael was sent to assassinate Gedaliah by the Ammonite king Baalish. Okay? So we don't entirely know his motive, though. There's some speculation, but it's not really very clear within the text. After this happens, those who assassinated Gedaliah, they end up fleeing into Egypt because they're afraid now, once they kill Gedaliah, now they're afraid Nebuchadnezzar is going to, be upset that they have assassinated the governor that he's appointed, and so he's going to come back. So they end up fleeing to Egypt, and they take Jeremiah with them. But overall, this is the major historical context of the book of Jeremiah. So here are the notes for the maps and images that I used. Okay, so thank you. Hopefully you have a better picture of the historical context of the book of Jeremiah.